Okay, we are live.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Good evening and welcome to the joint meeting of the Common Council Finance and Claims Committee and the Board of Education Finance Committee for today, Thursday, January 12, 2023, beginning 6:03 p.m. Before we proceed with the agenda, we'd like to call the roll of the two committees. For the Finance and Claims Committee of the Common Council, we have Council Member John Kides, Council Member Ben McMurr, Council Member Nora Djelski-Eichner, and Council Member Diana Revolus, and myself, Council Member Greg Burnett. We also have council members who are not on the Finance Committee but have zoomed in. Tom Livingston and Heidi Alterman. So over to you, Sherry, for the roll call of the Board of Ed Finance Committee.
So we have on Karen Nelson Bakey and Diane Carpio and myself. We are members of the Board of Education Finance Committee. And I also have some other board members who were on. I see Janine Rudolph, Mary Ellen Flaherty is also on, and Colin Hostin is on. Did I miss anyone? I think that's everybody from the Board of Education.
Okay, great. Before we move to public participation, Mayor Rilling will not be able to join us this evening unless situations change, but Dr. Estrella, you might have some opening comments before we move into the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this collaborative conversation around the budget. Mr. Asmani will speak to some of the main drivers within our budget, particularly the increased costs associated with serving our students in special education, the ESSER funds being depleted at the culmination of this fiscal year, as well as increased costs around medical expenses and other expenses to run our organization in an efficient and appropriate manner. As you know, we are coming to the tail end of the pandemic, but the needs that have developed as a result of the pandemic will continue to exist for a period of time, particularly when we speak to the learning needs of our scholars and how to most effectively support them, not only academically, but also socio-emotionally. We have made some positive strides over the course of this past year in bringing in supports that have yielded improved outcomes for our students, particularly in the social emotional development as well as their academic development. But the work that we have doesn't culminate at the end of this fiscal year when those funds deplete. The work continues. The need for interventions and additional supports remains. And we are hoping that as we continue to engage in this collaborative conversation, that we take into account the need, and that you can see as we speak to the different elements, the importance of continuing to provide these resources so that our students can have the education that they deserve and are entitled to. I'm going to turn it over back to you, Mr. Burnett, unless you want me to turn it over to Mr. Asmani.
Before we, thank you, Dr. Strayer. Before we go over to Mr. Asmani, we do have, we'll open it up for public participations. Board member Sherry McCready Pritchard, I don't know if you had any opening comments. You're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett. I look forward to engaging in these conversations with my co-members of the Board of Education, as well as the Board of Education Administration and the Common Council members. looking forward to getting some interesting questions and hearing comments. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Larry, can you see if there's any hands raised for public participation? Anyone that wishes to speak? If you do, please raise your, if you're logged on and you wish to speak, please raise your hand electronically and we will acknowledge you. You'll have 3 minutes to share your comments. Please state your name clearly for the record. And Larry, let's see if there's anyone that wishes to speak at this time.
Yes, the first person we have is Diane Laricella.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for arranging for this joint meeting. Very important, and it's a wonderful way to increase everyone's communication, which is the goal. I have been happy and blessed to meet many of you, especially our newer Board of Education members. For the record, my name is Diane Laricella. I've lived in Norwalk for over 37 years. Throughout that time, when it comes to budget making, I have attempted to download my brain, which is professionally trained in trying to assist with environmental management strategies. This includes at times energy management, waste management, and how to help communicate needs so that we can achieve reductions on that level. I ask that I will be forwarding information later, but the key areas, and I have been through many of these joint meetings and similar, where people say they're looking under every rock, they're turning over every rock in order to find savings in our Board of Education budget. However, I'm finding in my review of the past 2 or 3 years of budget making, our energy needs are not being efficiently put together. Our electricity levels are too high. We are using too much natural or fracked gas. And of course, oil is still a thing that we are using. We are making strides, but we are not optimizing the use of solar energy with expanding to ground-mounted and canopy parking lots. I have had many, many discussions about this. If we are really taking savings to the taxpayers seriously, we need to optimize and expedite this. On waste management, I will say it is well known that the City of Norwalk, that the Board of Ed, NPS, does not have an effective strategy for recycling waste materials that, if pulled out of the waste stream, will save money. Even if it's not millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars could be useful and be used with the children and the teachers. We're allowing food scraps, which are heavy and expensive to remove, not to be recovered and sold or brought to a place where they're turned into useful compost. There's also a problem with our HVAC in that we need consistent maintenance, and I hope that these ARPA funds and infrastructure funds will be used wisely while we have them to upgrade our HVAC and not kind of just put a Band-Aid on some systems that are in dire need. I thank you for pulling this together. Lastly, I wanted to state that we need to reduce the Board of Ed's legal budget. And I recently experienced the Cranberry School reconstruction. And because of the way the city decided to handle that issue, more legal money and delays occurred, not because of citizens that had a question, but because of the city and the Norwalk Public Schools and the building management director digging their heels in and refusing to have a good conversation. Thank you and good luck. In the future, I will be contacting some of you about what I just stated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Laricella. Larry, is there anyone else that has their hand raised that wishes to speak?
If anyone else would wish to address the joint committee, please raise your hand electronically now. I do not see anyone with their hands.
Thank you, Larry. With that, we will close public participation and move into the presentations for today's meeting. And we have the City of Norwalk Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Henry Dakowitz, that will cover some materials first, followed by the Norwalk Public Schools Chief Financial Officer, Lunda Asmani. You can ask questions throughout the presentations. I would only ask that if you do have a question, please raise your hand electronically, and we will acknowledge each and every hand that is raised to address your questions. So with that, Mr. Dakowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett. Mr. Ellis will be sharing his screen for our presentation. We have it. Can we put it on slide mode? No. Okay, let's
Click slide. Where'd it go?
I'm in slide master now. Like that.
You might want to stop sharing and till you can get it back in order.
What was it, Larry?
Click on slideshow. I think that will. Yeah, right there.
There we go. I'm
Yeah.
sharing my screen.
Okay.
I got it. That's why we have backup plans. Thank you. Well, I think we're on yours, Henry.
Who's sharing their screen?
Okay, I have mine now.
Mr. Burnett, Ralph Elancisi and Mary Ann Shepherd are in the attendees. Can they be elevated to panelists?
Yes. Larry, did you hear that?
Yes, I'm promoting them now.
Thank you.
There we go. Better? Can you see my screen, Greg? Do you see the presentation cover page?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So Tom, let's go to the next page. So we're facing a challenging economic outlook. We're dealing with stagflation, high inflation plus economic recession. Inflation was 8.2% in September of this year. It has come down a bit, but both the chairman of the Federal Reserve and many economists feel it's not going away anytime soon. In the first 2 quarters of 2022, we had negative GDP growth, which is the definition of a recession. The third and fourth quarters were positive, but there are expectations that in 2023, we will have negative economic growth. Interest rates have increased significantly from the Federal Reserve short-term rates, US Treasury, borrowing rates for credit cards, autos, and mortgages. The housing market is starting to falter, both in the number of sales and in the prices because of the increase in mortgage rates. Stock markets are officially in a bear market, although there's been some recovery later. And the strengthening, because of the higher US interest rates, it's strengthening the US dollar against foreign currencies, which may cause unexpected consequences throughout the world. Tom, click again, please. National firms announcing layoffs. Goldman Sachs laying off, I think it was 3,200 people yesterday. Credit Suisse, Apple, Facebook, Peloton, Novartis, Amazon, Ford, Nestle. It's not just any one industry. Private industries are retrenching because they are concerned about the expectations for 2023. Connecticut firms announcing layoffs was Stanley Black & Decker, M&T Bank. Semaphore has announced the closing of all of their labs in Connecticut. They are moving their headquarters to a smaller location in Stamford. Full Frontal, cable TV show, laid off 63 people in Norwalk. And there was a poll October 3rd saying the voters' most important issues were inflation, the cost of living, and the economy. The impact on our budgeting here, we're looking at tight controls on spending increases. Each department has been asked to manage any request for a spending increase to be contained between 2.5% and 3.5% for fiscal 24. We've had the first round of requests from the departments. Some have come in even larger than 3.5%. We've sat with the mayor. We will sit with him again before the mayor and I issue our joint recommendation. There are some fixed cost budget items which may have higher increases, expectation in the 7 to 12% range. Health insurance, pension, OPEB, and debt service. Because of some fortuitous circumstances, health insurance and OPEB may come in lower than the 7% minimum I expected 2 months ago. But overall, we will definitely have some items in that 7 to 12% range. So our expectation is to offset the increases of these less controllable items by utilizing some ARPA grant funds if available, and drawing down on our long-term undesignated unallocated reserves, also known as the rainy day funds. We've built the drawdown of the rainy day funds into our budget, and we are still examining ARPA. We're very concerned about the negative economic impact on our taxpayers. Individuals may be asked to cut back on their hours of work. They may lose jobs. Companies and employers may go out of business. Connecticut has still not recovered all of the jobs lost since the 2008 recession 15 years ago. There have been migration of taxpayers from Connecticut to low tax states. It's been offset by some of the migration during COVID from Boston and New York. And at this point, we cannot expect federal or state assistance, such as the funding we received in the recent past for COVID and the ARPA funding. Here's what we propose to do. We continue to provide essential municipal services at the lowest possible cost and minimize the tax increases to our taxpayers. We want to manage as best we can the less controllable costs of debt service and employee benefits. We are always working to identify opportunities to reduce spending and prioritize additional increases. And we want to offset the total spending increases by utilizing ARPA funds and drawing down on our rainy day funds. Tom, any more clicks?
That's it.
All right. So I presented this in November. The environment has not changed materially in a positive way. So that's the framework of our budget. As I said, we have had all of the departments submit their requests to us, and it's loaded into our financial software. We've met with the mayor in the beginning of February. I believe it's the second week. I will be presenting the joint mayor and CFO recommended budget, and then we go further from there. Thank you. I'll happy to answer any questions anyone has. Ms. Bakey?
Yes, hi, Mr. Dakowitz, and thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the rainy day fund a couple times in the presentation, and I'm curious to know what has been the lowest fund balance in the city's rainy day fund when the city has still had a AAA bond rating, and what is the current rainy day fund?
The current rainy day fund as of June 30, 2022 is approximately $74 million. To the best of my knowledge, we've always had a rainy day fund while we were AAA. It was smaller. I think under the mayor's tenure, the last 9 years, it has just increased. We tend to look at the rainy day fund as a percentage of our operating expenses. And I will tell you, the rating agencies have informed me that the Northeast of the country handles rainy day funds very differently than the rest of the country. In the rest of the country, it's common to have rainy day funds at the 50 to 75, even 100% ratio to operating expenses. And that's both at state, county, and local governments. In the Northeast, we tend to have lower ratios. We have a policy that recommends that the rainy day fund should be between 7.5% and 15%. Right now, we are probably in the 18 to 19% range. Given the circumstances, post-COVID, going into this stagflation economy, that's why I have recommended from day one that we draw down on the rainy day fund to help offset the tax increases for our taxpayers. The challenge, especially this coming summer when we borrow more money, we already have about $350 million of bonds outstanding. 2 years ago, our financial advisor calculated that if we have $400 million or more of debt for our size city, we run the risk of losing our AAA bond rating. The second major metric is the ratio of our debt service costs. That's the cost in our annual operating budget of repaying principal and paying interest on our debt. The metric the rating agencies look at for AAA is 10% or lower. We are dangerously close to that 10% already. So the reason I mention that is because a healthy rainy day fund is a major offset to the rating analysts' concerns. By having a healthy rainy day fund, they can relax a bit and say, well, if the city comes under pressure, we know they have $75 million with which to pay the principal and debt as it comes due. So as we take that down, that comfort lessens, and it's a balancing act.
Thank you for that explanation.
You're welcome. Ms. Alterman?
Hi there. Thank you so much. I had two questions. One, I am curious, the interest rate that the rainy day fund accrues, is that at like inflation rate or lower? I assume lower, but I just want a clarification.
Well, the rainy day fund, as with all of our cash on our balance sheet,
Mhm.
is invested. We have strict limitations on the types of investments we can make because the most important consideration is preservation of principal. So we tend to look at fixed debt issuances from the federal government or from federal agencies, Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae, that sort of thing. We don't go too far out on the yield curve, especially now with interest rates going up. We prefer to invest short term and then roll it over as interest rates go up. I believe right now we don't have term investments of longer than 2 years. But the investments we make on our excess cash are managed. We have an outside advisor with Morgan Stanley who manages all these funds. There are restrictions on unexpended bond proceeds. When we borrow money at a reduced rate, which is subsidized by the federal government, because investors are not required to pay federal income tax on those investments, the interest rates with which we borrow tend to be lower. However, the IRS requirements say you are not allowed to earn investment income on those unexpended bond proceeds in excess of your borrowing rate, what's known as the arbitrage rate. That's why we set up the funds with Morgan Stanley. Each time we borrow, we put it into a separate account because each bond borrowing has a separate arbitrage yield restriction. But on the investment side, we're able to capture the increased yield of the market as interest rates go up. On the other side, let me just mention when we borrow money, we borrow at a fixed rate and we're borrowing for anywhere from 15 to 30 years. So consequently, the last 3 borrowings, we borrowed at 1.75% for 30 years, 2%, and last year, 3.6%. Those rates are locked in. So we are getting the benefit of having hit the market at opportune times.
That was one of my other questions. Is it a locked-in rate or does it change? The last question I had, sorry, I'm trying to be brief, was how much money did the city roll over last year? I think it was around 12 million, but I honestly don't know if I'm misremembering.
Sorry, I missed the key word. How much money does the city
Did the city roll over last year?
roll over? You mean because we had a budget surplus?
Yeah.
Tom, maybe you can help me, but I believe it was less than $1.5 million.
Yeah, I was going to say 2-ish, but probably somewhere in the 1.5 to 2 range.
The distinction is that, and Linda, you may want to address this. I believe it's a state rule that allows the Board of Ed to roll over, or at least to request a rollover of up to 2% of its budget if it has that level of surplus. And that's part of how the Board of Ed manages their finances. Except for that, they generally do not have an opportunity to roll funds more than 1 year.
But that's the Board of Ed, right?
That's the Board of Ed. So the Board of Ed's budget last year was about 218 million. So if they run a surplus of 4.35 million, they are allowed to petition us. And I don't know, I'm not sure whether it's the mayor or the council approves, but if approved, that fund, even though it's a surplus, doesn't go into our rainy day fund. It gets added to the Board of Ed's budget for the next year.
Okay. I think I'm asking my question incorrectly, but I'll let somebody else ask for a second. Thank you.
You're welcome. Miss McCready Pritchett?
Hi, relative to pandemic funds, since there's been a lot of discussion around pandemic funds, how did the city use the pandemic relief funds, and how much of those funds are left, if there is any that's left on that's not spent? Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome. I'll let Tom chime in. He might be closer to some of the numbers.
Yeah, I think we just got updated numbers, and if my memory's right, we have about 7 million left. And
well, I'd like to make a distinction, Tom. Maybe let me.
Yes.
There really were two rounds of funds. One was COVID relief. And that money tended to go from the federal government to the state and then released to us. We also got some COVID relief funds from FEMA directly from the federal government. FEMA is very restrictive. They only offered, I believe it might be a limit of 75%
Yeah.
of the amount requested. So the funds from the state that were offered stated, if you petition FEMA and only got 75%, we will cover that 25%. Those funds were often used for overtime from the police, cleaning of buildings, and directly related to the expenses associated with COVID. Okay, that tended to come in fiscal 20 and 21. Okay. Then we had the ARPA funds. And with the ARPA funds, because Connecticut does not have operational county governments, we got an allocation as a city, and then the federal government gave allocations to Connecticut cities on a per capita basis to compensate for the lack of county funds that were given to governments in other states. I'll let Linda talk about what the schools got, but on the city side, we got a total of $39 million. What we did originally was we designated half that money to be offsets to our tax increases. We're not allowed to reduce our taxes, but we were allowed to offset future increases. So in year one, we designated, I believe it was around $11 million to offset the budget, so that when we set the tax rate, we reduce the amount of what's known as the net tax levy by $11 million, which directly reduces the mill rate and the average tax bill. During the year, which was last fiscal year, the state changed the formula for pilot payments. Pilot stands for payments in lieu of taxes. There are nonprofits, primarily hospitals and colleges, who are not subject to normal taxes. So a system has been established for those institutions to pay pilot taxes to local governments. Connecticut changed the formula last year, and we are the beneficiaries of an additional $4 million per year. So because of that, we took the $11 million allocation of the ARPA funds and we reduced it to 7. We said, we're already getting a benefit that we didn't expect in the budget of $4 million. So let's only take 7 million out of the ARPA funds, and we put it back into the pool of ARPA funds available for spending. You should be aware, ARPA funds were being designated for programs and tended to be capital projects, bigger projects where there wasn't funding. And we have a strict accounting. Chitsime Lamb, our controller who's on the call, has done the bookkeeping first to make sure that we've gotten all the funds, the 39 million and change that we expected from the federal government. And secondly, the allocation by projects as they were reviewed by the council. And then third, monitoring how much is actually spent, just like any other capital project. When we have an approved capital project, the amount approved is considered the budget limit. That's the limit you can spend. So we took the allocation from ARPA as the budget limit. She now monitors how much we spend against that limit. And we prepare reports every quarter to the federal government Treasury Department as demanded, where we explain how we're allocating the funds, how much has been spent to date, what is remaining. And also, there are restrictions. There are about 5 categories that the Treasury specified for ARPA. Those funds have to be used for one of those 5 applications. We worked on that when we first allocated the funds and set up the projects. Every project was linked to one of those 5 categories, and in fact went down. There's another layer. There might have been 10 or 12 subclassifications under one of those 5 broad categories. And we ensured that from the moment we allocated funds, every project was linked to the required expenditure categories from the Treasury government. And now I've talked so much, I forgot the question.
I just conscious of the time. We have 20 minutes left. We have 3 hands raised. So Henry, if you net out your
I'll wrap up
responses,
very
we'll
quickly.
be able to
I'll wrap up
move
very
forward.
quick.
So we have Mary Ellen's hand up, Diana's hand up, and
Okay, very quickly.
Janine's hand up.
That first year, the 7 million, we didn't need that. That was fiscal year 22. So we put that back into the pool, and we currently have about $9 million available to be allocated for projects. We expect to have them allocated this year. I'm sorry. Ms. Flaherty Ludwig? You're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Dakowicz. My question involves some of what the city is doing, but I'm going to direct it to Londa because I would like to know a comparison between the rainy day fund in the city and the rollover on on the Board of Ed funding for the last couple of years. You know, how does that compare, Londa, in terms of the amount of money per the budget?
Sure, I'll share. That was going to be part of my presentation. So let me see here. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the very last slide is where, oops, went too far. So to answer your question, this is from 2015-16 going down, you'll see what the addition to the fund balance is on the city side, which are the numbers to my left, and then to my right are the BOE carryover funds. So as you know, as Henry stated, the statute is 10248-A, which allows for boards of ed to go to the city to request, used to be 1%, and I think midway through this graph, that amount changed to 2% in terms of carryover addition. So on the city side, you could see what was left at the end of the year. As Henry stated, there are different buckets. Some of this is unassigned, some of this is assigned, some of this is designated. But this is probably as close as to an apples to apples comparison to see what was actually left over each year and either dropped into the fund balance account, which was later designated, and what ended up being carryover on the Board of Ed side. And obviously on the Board of Ed, when we do these carryover, they are approved by the BET. And each year we've gone before them, we have explained what the uses of those funds are. So the numbers to the right are what has been added to the total fund balance of the city within the various buckets. And the numbers to the left are the undesignated carryover amounts on the city. They're actually designated for those uses highlighted there.
Thank you, Londa. I think that's helpful to know what the comparison of rollover is in both the city and the BOE. Of course, the BOE has a larger budget by somewhat, but thank you for that.
Okay, if you can stop sharing your screen, Londa. We have 2 more hands up before you can move to your presentation.
Common Council
Diana?
President Greg, Common Council.
Yes. You're muted.
I'm respectfully asking you to move on to some of your council members who may want to speak.
I do not see any. I do not see any council members having their hands raised. So we wanted to address each person that has their hands raised. So the only hand raised left is Janine Randall.
With all due respect, President Burnett, we haven't seen the presentation to ask any questions yet. This is all city stuff so far that we know the answers to.
That is correct. Thank you. So that's why we want to get through these last three questions. So to give Luda an opportunity to share his information. So if your question has already been answered, I would respectfully ask you hold on it so that we can move on to the presentation. I still see three hands up, so please ask your questions.
Okay. I was going to ask, given that the city, when we zero funded the local budget in fiscal year 21, and 80% of the local budget is made up of the wages and benefits, if there was a city strategy for when the funds were going to expire in 2 years, a strategy from the city side. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Just trying to figure out if there was any kind of planning going forward when we didn't get the additional funding or the funding that we thought we were going to get for fiscal year 21 in the local budget, to go forward and see if there was any kind of plan on what we should do, or the city had any kind of strategy for what we were going to do to offset these expiring funds.
I see. I would just say that one of the things we did with the ARPA funds was that anyone who was hired on a grant fund basis, which is commonly done when we have grant funds, which are temporary or limited in scope. So someone who was hired under grant fund auspices knows that if we lose the grant or when the grant funds expire, they lose their job. And we made sure on the city side that anyone we hired was done on that basis. And we did it on a very limited basis. Any programs that we set up with ARPA funds are limited in funding to those ARPA funds. And we explained that without ARPA, you have to come through the budget process to get specific approval again. So that's how we handled it. I hope that
Greg?
answers your question.
Okay, Diana, did you have your hand up, or did you?
Greg, can I make
You
a
lowered
comment?
it.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
In the interest of time, I'm going to recommend that we ask Mr. Osmani to make his presentation. And then we can
Sure.
circle back after that with questions, okay? Because it's already
Excellent.
quarter to 7, so. All right, thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. So I will try and quickly get through the remaining slides and then continue to provide members the opportunity to ask questions. So the way we see the budget, we started up the budget with looking at the trajectory of funding. And so what you have on this chart is the historic funding levels that the city has provided to the Board of Ed beginning FY17 up through FY21. Which was at 5%. And in fiscal 22, that was the year where we received, where the ARPA funds were given to the city, and there was that 0% funding. And therefore we flatlined. And so you'll see that that blue bar kind of begins to deviate. The following year, which is the year that we're in now, the city did provide 4.5%. And now in fiscal year 24, with those funds expiring, we are back to where the chart sees. And so what I attempted to do here was to draw the dotted line basically to show, had there not been any ARPA, had we continued with the traditional funding levels, this is where we would have been if you follow those dotted lines. And the dotted line is basically looking at the average increases over the past years, had those continued, because the average increase over the past years has been the trend on the city side. So it was making that assumption. So we kind of deviated because of the ARPA funds, and as a result, just to get back in line to where we would have been with the same amount of resources, it would require about 8.5% from where we are today. And this is how we look at this budget. So 8.5% gets us back to the trajectory that we deviated from when we did the 0% funding. In terms of the drivers for this budget, there are basically four. Obviously, contractual wage increases with benefits and service increases. We have contracts that are going up, and so that is a driver. We'll talk about what happened when we had the 0% ARPA. I think it's an important distinction to make, and I'll make that as we go through. The city and the Board of Ed are different in terms of the ARPA and ESSER rules. We had specific rules in terms of what needed to be addressed. Yes, there were some one-time expenses within those ESSER funds that we did apply, but then there were other things that we will talk about that did require resources and personnel to address. And obviously the 0% funding played a role in allowing us to make the budget for that specific year. And then obviously we'll talk about special education and additional positions. So just looking at that graph again, in terms of what the drivers are and where the budget has come from, we see our drivers, again, the three major drivers, the base budget request at 5%. That is more the contractual salary wages, the contractual increases in services and contracts that we have for security, for internet, and all of those things. So those come up to about 5%. We talked about what happened with the 0%, and I believe there was a question earlier with a budget that's 85% funded in personnel, and you provide a 0% funding with the caveat that we needed to continue to provide service, continue to educate kids, and at the same time, not to lay off anyone during the pandemic. That's basically what we had to do. There is only certain amount of things that are one time and recurring on the Board of Ed side. On the city side, if you talk about those 5 categories that Henry referenced, there were quite a number of one-time expenses: sewer projects, economic development projects, aiding businesses. Well, those were not among the categories of uses on the Board of Ed side, not just our Board of Ed, but all boards of ed within the state and around the country. And so the makeup of our two bodies is very different, and the instructions and the identified uses of those dollars is also very different. So I think it's important to provide that distinction, and we'll talk about special education and some of the trends we're seeing on the special education. So for that base component of the budget, where does the money go? We use our funds in these 5 broad categories. Classroom and school services typically accounts for about 80% of our budget, and that's what drives 85% for the most part of our request. Operations, our facilities, our custodial agreements, our security agreements, those are a driver as well. Business services, general administration, and when we constructed this budget, we actually reevaluated professional development. We're doing more in-house professional development and professional training, so we actually saw a negative driver in terms of professional development within the district. In terms of our special education drivers, and we're happy to provide some additional information, one of the characters of our special education is our out-of-district costs. These are costs that we have no control over. As we get more students with special needs that come to our district and are qualified for out-of-district care and education, we are mandated to provide those expenses. Those expenses have not remained flat, they have increased. The number of students needing outside district services has increased. The cost of providing those services has also increased. Another driver in the special education is grants. We receive quite a number of grants that provide special education services. What we have seen over the past 2 years is that the value of these grants has gone down for a number of reasons. To offset the cost of the local tax base, we do have positions that are funded by these grant dollars. We have the IDEA grant, IDEA grant that funds teachers. We have the Medicaid grant that we get for Medicaid billing, and we use those revenues to fund teachers to offset the cost on the tax base. So that's a driver. And then just general contracted services that we provide with increases. And so our special education costs this year alone are $6.3 million over and above what they were last year. This year, we had budgeted $10 million. We had budgeted $9 million for special education. We're probably going to be at about $10.2 million in the current year. The Board of Ed has been approving transfers from as early as October, just moving monies between accounts because we already anticipate that the approved budget this year for special education expenses has gone up. So briefly talking about the ESSER and the distinction between what the charge was on the Board of Ed side and what the charge was on the city side. In Connecticut, our charge was very simple. For ESSER, the Connecticut State Department revisited the state level priorities, and the instruction to the school was to collectively call for school districts to think boldly and to create transformative programs for the students of Connecticut. This was the charge by the state. There were categories of ESSER funding that we needed to address. In our application for ESSER funding, these were the 3 areas that we identified for uses of the ESSER funds. We were going to use our dollars for learning acceleration, academic renewal, and student enrichment, social, emotional, mental health, and for students and staff, and then also building safe and healthy schools. So these were the parameters within which we could use those ESSER dollars. Now, are there one-time things that we could have used these ESSER dollars for? Yes, there were. And this is a listing of some of those one-time things that we did that we referred to non-recurring. Over the past couple of years, we've spent, at the time of running this report, just over $8 million. That number has since increased in terms of one-time funds of ESSERs for technology, learning acceleration, Summer Academy, literacy resources, contracted services, and obviously the most common, the PPE, contact tracing, staffing, and all of those things, updating the bathrooms. These were one-time expenses. However, there were some recurring expenses with these ESSER funds. When we were zero funded that year, we had at the time requested, I believe we were at a 4.5% increase. And so with that 0% funding, we had to figure out, and the instruction was to use ESSER dollars. We had to identify what things in the current budget qualify for ESSER funding. And at the same time, achieve the goal of 0% funding and providing those services. So we categorize these expenses in 2 buckets. The first bucket is what we refer to as addressing the 0% increase. We made some modifications, but social counselors, school counselors, and social workers were 2 categories that fit within the description of ESSER funding. And so what we did that year is we applied some of those ESSER funds to meet that goal, because these were positions that already existed. These were not new positions. These were positions that we had requested continuing funding for because they were our staff and we had already received funding, but because of the 0%, we applied ESSER dollars towards those. A couple slides back, I talked about those charges for ESSER, addressing learning, addressing social emotional issues. With those ESSER dollars, we did what we refer to as category B expenses. We did add additional positions with the ESSER funds. So there are 2 categories of positions. We had a group of positions that always existed, but needed funding because we were 0% funded. They qualified under ESSER and we funded them that way. And then there was this charge to boldly provide services and meet education needs that we applied ESSER dollars for. So in a nutshell, that's what we use the ESSER dollars for. Commissioner Huvelman, you had asked a question a while back about the rollover. I kind of went over this slide, so I won't go over it again, but this is just showing what the rollover funds have been on the city side, comparing that to the Board of Ed side, again, with a caveat that the funds on the city side do get aggregated, undesignated, reserved, and so forth. But these numbers are straight from the audit, and I reference the page in the audit book where these numbers are coming from. And then finally, I know I'm running out of time. We do have additional information on the website. This year, we've created a designated page on the Norwalk Public School website that has this information with question and answers. And I did believe we emailed you an electronic version of the budget book that has a lot more information. And you should be receiving your hard copy books today and tomorrow. And with that, I would like to end there. And answer questions that you may have at this point. I can't see all hands, and so let me see. Let me stop sharing. I do see Councilmember Huvelman with a hand.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you putting those numbers together, but I take exception with the concept or the idea that you're talking about apples to apples when you're talking about your excess budget fund and the city's excess tax fund. It's not really the same thing, and it reads to me as a disingenuous comparison when we're talking about what the for quotes, rainy day fund is in comparison to what the rollover budget funds from the Board of Ed. That's money that you didn't spend in the given year, and you're asking for it to not go back into the general fund, but asking to be able to utilize it in that given year, whereas the rainy day fund has a much larger, broader expanse for the city in order to allow us to maintain a AAA bond rating, in order to allow us to have money for emergency situations that may arise. We have storms that come through, we have various things that the possibility exists that we would have to make a very large expenditure in any given time. So I'm just troubled by making an apples to apples comparison, and that's really all I'll say.
Sure, and I think that's a fair point. I think what's important to note is historically, for example, I'll talk about last year, right? So last year we had requested funding for the South Norwalk School Incubator, right? And through the budget process, there was an understanding that we're not going to raise tax dollars because we have stress on the tax dollars. However, since you have these unexpended funds because of turnover, the same reasons that led to the city having rollover funds, go ahead and use those dollars to apply. And so that has really been the use of these funds year after year. They've not been blanketed rollover funds on a yearly basis. There's been designated
which I completely understand, and that's fine. My point is that the Board of Ed, the NPS, the public school system, is a department of the city of Norwalk. You have a budget, the Public Works has a budget, all the other agencies of the city of Norwalk have budgets that they operate on. They spend the money or they don't spend the money. At the end of the given year, the money comes back into the general fund. My point is that you're doing the same thing. Statutorily, the state says that you can request the use of that money up to a certain percentage, which is fine. If we want to lobby the state to have it be more of a percentage, that's fine too. But it's just not an apples to apples comparison. And I feel that it's a disingenuous thing in a public meeting to try to project that idea. It's not apples to apples. The city as a whole, that money goes into the rainy day fund. The separate silos that we have for city agencies are separate silos for those city agencies and handled in a different way. Statutorily, the Board of Ed is allowed to take some of that extra money and utilize it if they request it, and which you should absolutely use it. And the fact that you were able to do the South Norwalk Incubator School because there was money left over from the rollover, I think that's fantastic. But I take exception with the idea that we're talking apples to apples when we're not. That's the only point that I have.
Sure, your exception is noted, Commissioner. Councilman.
Now we have two additional hands raised. Godfrey Azuma, your question?
Azima, so Dave, I too appreciate, your point around just it's not apples to apples, and looking at us in the respect of aligning our understanding of our budget to other departments. What we're not speaking to is the youth that we are serving. And I think to understand our budget is understanding the needs of the youth that we're serving. A constant thread since fiscal year 21 has been the need for mental health services in the school. I think it's definitely been repeated and articulated each year we've come before you. And the problem has not gone away that we presented in each fiscal year. And looking at the impact it's had now, it's probably the thing I'm most concerned about when I really look at our capacity to plug in the things we need to have in place to meet our goals. The mental well-being of our youth, especially a community like this, it's shown and how they've used the increased resources that's been provided by our generous philanthropic partners. And what is not spoken in detail about, which I firmly believe should be a whole other conversation, is what they're supporting us, the financial support and the value add they've brought to each of our buildings has been tremendous. And I point it out because they don't do it with the intent to do it forever. And in a place of somewhere we can start a collaborative discussion, the issues presented surround our youth mental wellness will have an enormous impact. And the more we discuss budget doesn't allow us to really dive into understanding the things you can't measure, quantify, dollar out for how we respond to it. This community went through a need of needing more mental health services at a time where they were not available and still unavailable. That is not typical amongst people of color within a city that has a myriad of different cultures represent. It's probably the first time I've ever heard or seen it. And I want to make sure people don't lose sight of that and understanding how community issues are not siloed in the community. We are one. They play out in our experience all in the school buildings. This will be further articulated in a presentation from TMP, but I think it's important to go into that because the discussion of numbers and the impact of the budget and us not getting what we're requesting, the teachers are experiencing it, and it makes it harder for us to do more with less. It shouldn't be an apples to apples discussion. It should be a very detailed discussion around what it is that we're experiencing that isn't represented in a clean budget discussion.
Jen McMurray.
Thank you so much, President Burnett. I agree with a lot of what Godfrey just said, and I think that he makes a lot of good points. Like, we need social workers, we need counselors, we need special educators. I don't disagree with any of the things you guys are saying about those being needs. My daughter is special needs. I see the need in that, and it's probably been a long time coming, honestly. What we have to look at on the city side is wants versus needs. And so I don't disagree with any of the things you're saying about these being needs. And I know that you were flat funded. I was not on council at that time, but it comes up a lot. It has come up a lot tonight. I understand that. And there was a 3%, I think was the number that you presented, Mr. Osmani. You know, and I understand this is, you know, we are in a trying time financially. I get that. What I would ask, and I did ask these questions last time, and I haven't gotten an answer yet, so I'm not sure if that's going to be addressed tonight, but you know, how much is the South Norwalk Incubator costing? What is the enrollment? What is the projected enrollment coming up? How much is that going to increase the budget for that? Because that is also rolled into your operating. How much does the Welcome Center cost? These are wonderful ideas, but in my opinion, these are wants and not needs. And it would go a very long way to see that some of those funds were being used towards those needs, and then we could possibly make up the gaps that you still needed on the city side. But we cannot pay for everybody's wants and needs. I know we need special educators. We need math and reading specialists. We need social workers and counselors. Nobody is disputing that with you. I want to give that to you. I want our children to have that. But my question is, if you don't get this 12%, 7% increase that you get, what is your contingency plan? What is the plan moving forward? I mean, I've heard rumors that there's going to be massive layoffs. I don't want that to happen. I think we need teachers more than anything, probably, to run our schools successfully. So I'm just wondering what the strategy and thought process behind that is. And have we thought about that yet? And are we really balancing the wants and needs? Because unfortunately, we can't write a blank check to every single department in the city. I wish we could, but we just can't. So we have to prioritize the things that we can spend the money on, we need to spend the money on.
And that's a very good point. And I think that's why we're here. That's part of this process. I think what's challenging is not addressing that the 0% funding did have an impact. I think as we continue to move forward as if that did not happen, and just to assume that somehow that 0% will take care of itself and the Board of Ed should continue to do all of these services with 4.5% or 5% or 6% when that in fact happened. I think we also have to take a look at that. I mean, I looked back at the conversation on the BET when that decision was made, and that was a conversation. And my predecessor, Tom Hamilton, has brought this up for 2 years in a row. The fact that we are where we are now should not come as a surprise to anyone, right? Because we knew when you do 0%, it's going to catch up to you. It was a 1-year deal, 2-year deal, and it's going to catch up. And so that shouldn't surprise us. So I think the conversations moving forward should account for some of these known knowns, and then at the same time talk about wants versus needs, and those fours. So,
and I
thank you
think
for
it
that.
needs to happen on both sides, to your point. And I'm not so good with math. I'm not a finance person, so I'm going to ask for your help with this last one. You asked for 3%, right? Was it 3% in 2020, 2021? I know you and I weren't here, but
It was 3.8.
roughly 3 to 4. Let's just say 4. Let's say 4, just to be fair and pad it. So if you asked for another, let's say 4.5 or 5% this year, that brings us up to that 8-point-something% that you had. How did we get to 12.7 then?
So that, yeah, good point. Good question. The 8.7, the 8.5% is the normal trend of where the budget would have been. Now, I did talk about, it doesn't account for these extenuating special education expenses that have come up, the out-of-district increases. Those are not within the normal trends, right? So we've had increase in cost there. And so that's what's driving some of those other expenses. And then to your point, there were some additional positions that were added with using the ESSER funds for the improvement teachers that weren't there in the past. And that's why we intentionally segregate those two buckets of positions, right? There were the 0%, and then in all honesty, there were those others that we did because the need was there. Those were enhanced positions that didn't exist before. And so that's what gets us to that 12.5%, to your point, Jen.
Thank you very much.
Council Member Diana Revolus.
Thank you, Chair. I think we also need to remember that with these children that we want to talk about, being a parent here, having a new one, having a child that's graduating in Newark Public Schools, no children comes without a family. I think we're forgetting about the families who have to live and pay for these situations, and particularly those of lower hanging fruits and aren't able to do so. A lot of what you just said is also a part of my question of the places and spaces, the employment programs, so on, that we did on a grant basis that now, which was of concern prior to, would become responsibility of the city later on. It is a great and noble thing to speak on how we need to do for our children, of course, special education, of course. I do still remember there has been a deduction in enrollments for children since before the pandemic. And I personally know with concerns of parents of certain curriculums that are wanting to pull out their children from this, go into home education, or families who want to own homes and want to leave Norwalk. So again, with the decrease of certain students and the decrease in families of having to stay here, whether it be cost or the ability of ownership, how is that then perceived with the 12% that we're being asked for? Because yes, again, these parents, these families here, children come with families. Families will have to pay for this. How are we thinking of the totality of each family dynamic that goes into this? I think that's also removed from the ideals of what the city has to look for also. And at the end of the day, it's the BET that makes a final conversation, right? They put the final mallet to the hammer, basically. So I give onus, of course, to the devout call and talk of our children, but those children come with families, and I am 100% behind what Councilmember McMurray said about our wants and our needs. We have a lot of wants that were great, but our wants will become perpetual costs that we would have to pay for later. How detrimental is that to our residents? That's more of not only a question, but of an ask and of a thought process and pattern that I'm hoping that can be conveyed through these conversations. We are going to see a recession. We've been told this for that same amount of time as you got the zero funding. We've been told we are looking towards a recession. This is very evident and prevalent right now. I think, is there a way that we could come, and I know this is what we do in the budget season, but there definitely needs to be a coming to terms of maybe 12 may be too high, and seeing what we can do that is fair for not only our children, but the family they go home to after they leave our schools.
I think it needs to be noted that we went through an extensive process in making sure that we focus on needs and taking into account that what we were looking at was what we absolutely needed to support our students and our families. So we started off at about 18% given the programs and services we had, and we dwindled the budget down to 12.7%, and in that reduced certain programs and services, particularly those that were being provided by external providers. Doesn't mean that we don't need the services. It just means it was just, we needed to make sure that when we were looking at the needs of the district, we were doing it in such a way that took into account the community at large. At the same time, there were sacrifices made that in the long term might not be always in the best interest of students, particularly because we want to make sure that their social emotional needs are being met. And there's an array of services that are being provided that need to continue to be provided, particularly around social emotional interventions and academic interventions that our students desperately need. And our families continue to need support, even with South Norwalk. That's not a want, that is a need. And the services that are being provided to those families there become critical as we continue to think about how we serve the students in that community without having them transported throughout the districts at far distances, when they could have a place that they can go home close to their community. And I think that as we continue to transition, people tend to forget that the pandemic created an array of needs that might have not been there prior to, and there are other needs that were present that needed to be addressed, even in providing intervention services to identify areas of need for students, particularly through the SRBI process, that were non-existent. And many parents expressed to us concerns about their children being identified too late. And we wanted to make sure that that didn't happen, so that students receive the proper interventions early on, and in turn get the services that they need. And in the long run will cost the district less, because we are addressing the problem on its onset and not later on when it might require more resources than they would if addressed early on. So as we looked at the budget, we have been paying close attention to this, even looking at class size and making sure that when we were looking at what we needed, we took that into account as well, to make sure that we were maximizing our resources as best as we possibly could.
If I can just state, this is very important dialogue, very rich dialogue. Several members of the Finance Committee need to get off of this call to start the 7 o'clock finance meeting, which we're already late for. We have 2 hands still raised, so I would ask that those 2 hands address their questions, and after those 2 hands have been questions have been addressed, we move to adjourn, and if necessary, we can call for another meeting. So with that, I see Godfrey Azima. If you can ask your question, followed by Nicole Ayers. Thank you.
I haven't heard from Nicole, so please go ahead, Nicole. I'll let you go first.
Thank you, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm out of the country, so if my internet goes in and out, I'm apologizing in advance. I think my question is more of a comment, and it's twofold, and I'll keep it brief. What I would like to encourage my colleagues is that this is not the first or the last conversation or platform that we have. This budget situation, particularly with all our departments, but the most attention goes to the NPS, we need to have this more than one time in this cycle. It's beneficial for us as well as the BOE, and it's also beneficial for the constituents in which we serve. Additionally, Mr. Lunda, I think you're an awesome and wonderful city worker. I think you are diligent. I think you are doing the hard work, and I don't think you necessarily get the due shine that you should. But I agree with my colleague, Mr. Hewlin, but I also take fault in terminology. And it's really important because for some of us who read through the books and go back and forth, we might not have this issue. But when we start saying zero budget, that's problematic. It's not a zero budget, it was a zero increase. And so I would just ask that we correct our language and correct our terminology, that we don't say zero budget, because to a layman person, zero budget means you got no money. You received nothing. That's not true. And I know it is your desire to be true and accurate in all the processes that you get. So that's my first comment. Well, my third comment. My first comment is I think we need to do this again. My second comment is please let's be mindful of our terminology. And the last thing I would say, as my colleagues have to go to finance, is that my concern as someone who directly works with students, I do understand that there is a need for an increase in the services or to maintain the services and an increase of the budget. But as a parent, as a person who works with kids firsthand, my concern is if you're telling us you need this and for whatever reason, we are unable to give you what you need, I have yet heard what the contingency plan is. NPS is one department of many, and all of our departments, we have to tell them, I'm sorry, we cannot do this. I'm sorry, we cannot do that. And it really sat with me wrong. And David was eloquent in his explanation that we're comparing what is being done. It is a department who is making a request, and my colleagues and I are doing our best to answer your request, but be knowledgeable enough to say there's certain things that we can't do and there's certain things that we can. So just for the measure of time, I would ask that we continue this conversation, that we have another joint meeting in this budget cycle, and that we really, on both sides, do some examining on what we are able to give and what we are able to take away. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
My only request was to ask that we have a focused discussion around the mental health needs in our response, and a further understanding of the support provided by our philanthropic partners to understand the void of need that has to be met. You know, what we presented and asked for, when we didn't receive it, we still had to address the need. And I think a really firm understanding of what isn't reflected in the budget through the support of our partners will really, I think, begin a very concrete place to talk about how we plan to go forward together with this, because this not being addressed, I think, has definitely will have an impact on citywide services and really how we just are in a place to have our youth experience quality education. Thank you for everyone's points. Oh, sorry, Kira.
Yeah, I just had one quick follow-up to what you just said, Godfrey, which is that I would implore all council members to go and watch or read the minutes from our workshop this past Tuesday night, where we were presented on the mental health issues in the city, the survey results that were administered in October. It's really enlightening to see what our kids are going through, and I think it would be a good use of your time. Thank you.
Thank you. any other, one more hand and then motion to adjourn.
I'm sorry,
Nora?
Mr. Burnett, just so that you are aware, there was a question on the chat for some time from one of the council members that
We'll have to address that offline. I'm sorry, but we have to go to this other meeting.
okay, I
There's
just wanted
people
to be aware.
line for us.
And I apologize, Chair. I also need to obviously be in that meeting with you. One very brief point, and Henry, this is really a request for you, and I'm bringing it up at this meeting because it is relevant. As we discussed at great length last year, our biggest challenge from my perspective is that because we cannot change our tax rates and we cannot offer additional exemptions, our problem is that when we increase taxes, we are most likely to drive out of the city the students we are most likely trying to help. That is a problem. There's a function of state law and we cannot control. But in the meantime, Henry, we had asked last year if we could get a breakdown in this year's budget of the potential impact of the increases by senior citizens, by income levels, so that we can really understand what is the impact of these increases on our lowest income residents and our fixed income residents, so that we can making our evaluation not on averages citywide, but an understanding of the impact on our most struggling families. And I would just want to put that request forward for the city budget presentation coming up next month. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. That's exactly my point. Thank you.
Greg, do I have
Motion
time
to adjourn? Oh.
Yes, can we motion to adjourn, please? Because we have to
Motion
get
to
to
adjourn? this. I'm on that.
Very good. We'll continue the discussion. Thank you.